Head over to BoardGamePrices.com to see the best price on Sagrada the Passion and thousands of other games. Hello my friends, it's the Game Boy Geek here. Today, we're going back to those beautiful stained glass windows, but today, we're going to be using some rare glass, among other things. Today, we're taking a look at Sagrada, the Great Facade's Passion. The Great Facade is a three-part series of expansions for Sagrada, and Passion is the first of these three. It's a modular expansion. You can mix and match some of them or all of them. Let me show you how it works. I'll see you on the other side. The Passion comes with three new main modules. The first one are inspiration abilities. These are essentially special abilities that each player now will start with, one of them. You also have some new public objectives. Then the main focus here are these rare dice and the rare dice boards. We'll talk more about this and some private objectives to go along with these. Now the first of these will cover are the inspiration abilities. How this works is each of these gets shuffled and dealt one to each player. They put it face up and they let everyone know what their power is. Some of them is one per round, some of them is one per game. Like this one, after drafting you can spend a favor token to swap the drafted die for a die from the round track. Or here once per game you can gain up to 3 favor tokens off of a tool card and essentially getting them back. Once per round after drafting you can break a color and number restriction. Once per round you can re-roll the drafted die, and if you can't place it you got to return it where it came from. This one at the beginning of the game you lose a favor token, but once per round you can use a tool that only costs you 1 favor token. And then this last one here, after drafting, you can place that drafted die on this card if it's empty, and then at the end of the future round you can place this die on your window. So let's talk about the rare glass dice. There's many of these boards, and you'll randomly select one, and for each open slot you'll roll one of these new glass dice that come. You can't really tell, I don't think, in this video. They look just like sort of clear here. But they do have sort of a nice little metallicized bluish tint to some of these things. I'm not sure if you can see this, but it does look really cool. Anyway, how this works is instead of doing 3 tool cards like in the base game, you'd just use 2, but then you'd add one of these. And each of these do different things. Like this one costs 2 favor tokens, and in this case you would just take this. Now when you put this out, you roll the die and you put it here, and you'd spend 2 favors and you'd place this die anywhere in your window, and once that's taken, a new die would come out for other people that they could possibly take. So essentially, and this is a wild die, you can only have one of them in your window the whole game, but you don't have to worry about any of the sort of color restrictions with that rare glass die. And that color restriction meaning that you could place this next to any die, it doesn't matter what color is next to it. Now there's 5 other ones, and they all work different ways of how you get the die. Some of them has a variable cost. Like this one says, you pay favor tokens equal to the sum of the empty spaces that's in your top row. So here there's 2 empty spaces, it costs 2 favor tokens. You always just take the die that would be there and essentially you put it in your board like I showed you before. On the flash glass it costs 2, but you move a die in your window and then you place this die in that die's previous location. So it's allowing you to move and then put that die in there. This one here costs 2, and before placing the die in your window you roll a random die from the bag. So you take that random die from the bag, you roll it. If its value matches this die, you set this die to any value, then you return the random die to the bag, but it costs 2. So this one does have a little bit of luck involved where you can possibly get a die of your choosing there. Now this one here will have 3 dice in it. And if there's 3 dice here, the cost is 2. If there's 2 dice left, the cost is 1. If there's only 1 die there, the cost is 0. This is my favorite one because it's sort of like a rush. You got to pay more to get the die that you really want. And this last one also is a variable payment. You pay the amount of tokens depending on the empty spaces in the corners. So here there's 2 corners that are empty, you'd have to pay 2. Now to go along with those rare glass dice, there are some private objectives, and all of these go along with that rare glass dice. And if you use these, you don't use the private objectives from the base game. And they do different things, like for example, every unique color surrounding your glass die would be 3 points, or the sum of the highest value for each color adjacent to your rare glass die. Things like that. So they all pertain to that. Every die with the same value as your rare glass die is 3 points. Things like that. I'm not going to go over all of these. You can just pause the video and look at the rest of these private objectives. Now let's go over the last module, which are the new public objectives. Now they have to do with symmetry, that's why they're called symmetry public objectives. Like for example, if we look at this one, here's the middle column of a player board, and the 2 columns next to this in the same row, if they're the same color, and if the 2 on any of the ones that are the ends. So think of this as like folding over. So you've got these two columns or these two columns. If they're ever the ones in the same row have the same color, you'll get 3 points for either of those. It does sort of the same thing, but in this case with the shade, so the different numbers. This is doing the same type of thing with numbers, but now it's doing it in a different direction. Same with this with the symmetry of the colors. And then here you have intertwined colors, and you have diagonal color links. So these are the different ones that are in this new private objectives. This was my least favorite of the modules because I found that some of these symmetries just are impossible to do with some of the player boards, and so they kind of are at odds with some of the player boards. But here's the 6 ones. You can pause it to see all the abilities. All right, well, there is the Great Facade Passion. Now, I typically like sort of special abilities, asymmetry in games. So adding the inspiration abilities, I really like here. It kind of gives everybody their own special thing that they can do, gives the game more depth, gives the game more variability. Always a big fan of those things. And for here, yeah, it's kind of a no-brainer. Always play with these. Unless you're playing with someone who's never played the game before and they're not sort of a gamer, then I would leave them out. But if they're an experienced gamer, even if they haven't played Sagrada before, I'd say you could definitely mix these in right away. The rare glass module. So this expansion has most to do about these rare glass things. So now the module itself is kind of cool because it basically is in place of one of the 3 tools. Instead of having 3 tools, you have 2, but you have this one. And there's a lot of different ones you can choose from. Which makes the game, more variable with this expansion. And I like that, placing the rare glass dice is easier because it's sort of like a wild color, but they typically cost more than the other tools. And some of those, rare glass sort of boards there can have a variable, favor payment. So sometimes, depending on what you've done on your board, it will cost a certain amount difference depending on what you've done or what you're trying to do throughout the game. That was my favorite part of this module, was using the ones that kind of gave you it cost different depending on what you did. But it's still cool. It makes the game sort of different. Having those different boards is cool. The rare glass die private objectives. Now, obviously, if you're going to play with the rare glass die module, it's kind of a no-brainer to play with the private objectives. However, you don't play with the regular objectives with that. There'd just be too much, going on there. But if you're going to play with the rare glass, it's good to have those private objectives. You don't have to play with them every time, but you can if you want to. I would recommend it if you are playing with the rare glass dice because it gives you something to sort of focus on with that rare glass dice. It kind of like, ties them together, and it's a cool little thing. Now, there was one module that I didn't really care for, but again, this is a modular expansion, and you can mix and match anything you want. The Symmetry Public Objectives. Now, these are sort of more complicated public objectives than some of the other ones in the previous, the base game and in the first expansion, the 5 to 6 player expansion. It's a little more complicated, but the bigger problem I had is that some of these objectives can be at conflict with players' boards. Because a lot of them had to do with symmetry of, say, hey, from the columns, left to right, have the same numbers in these spots, or have the same colors in these spots. And then the other way around too, say, in the rows, do it this way and have symmetry. And the problem I have with this is that too many of the other boards that you'd be playing with that you slide in at the beginning, sometimes it's like, oh, well, this row, I could never do this objective in this spot because I have a 3 here and a 5 here that's symmetry, and I've got to have them, sort of the same or something like that. So I didn't like that aspect of this expansion. I probably would leave these ones out, but this was a personal preference. And it's only part of the the expansion that I did not like. But otherwise, it's a no-brainer. If you like Sagrada and you want more of it, more different things to think about, more variability, for under $15 online, it seems like a great buy to me. And that's Sagrada, the Great Facade's Passion.
This video was shot on a Game Topper, the ultimate gaming accessory. After successfully fulfilling their first Kickstarter, Game Toppers are taking the world by storm. Now you can get your own portable gaming top by participating in Game Topper's Kickstarter 2.0 starting June 25th, 2019. New styles, new sizes, and amazing new game mats. Go to GameToppersLLC.com to enter a full Game Topper system valued over $1,000 to also bring you to the Kickstarter project page and to late pledge.